Trump has made a secret deal with Putin, and Ukraine will pay the price. You may not want to hear this analysis, but the negotiations have been happening for months through intermediaries, and the framework is already in place. What we're witnessing isn't diplomatic chaos or unpredictable leadership. It's the most calculated geopolitical transaction in decades. The intelligence reaching my sources in Washington tells a clear story. Trump's team has been conducting back-channel communications with the Kremlin since before the election through carefully chosen intermediaries, the kind of people who can have conversations that never officially happened. The framework of the deal is elegant in its simplicity. Russia keeps the territories it currently occupies in Ukraine. America lifts sanctions gradually over 18 months. NATO expansion stops permanently. In exchange, Russia reduces its support for China and provides intelligence cooperation against Beijing. Ukraine gets abandoned, but America gets strategic realignment against the real threat. European leaders are panicking, but they're powerless to prevent what's coming. They've spent 3 years building their foreign policy around supporting Ukraine and containing Russia. Now they face the possibility that their primary ally will abandon that policy and actively reverse it. The betrayal isn't just of Ukraine. It's of the entire European security architecture. Volodymyr Zelensky understands what's happening, though he cannot admit it publicly. His increasingly desperate appeals for more weapons, more funding, more guarantees aren't coming from strength. They're coming from the realization that his window of American support is closing rapidly. Every speech now carries the subtext of abandonment. The timing isn't coincidental. Trump's inauguration will coincide with the exhaustion of European military aid to Ukraine and growing war fatigue among American voters. Trump will have both the mandate and the excuse to pursue a realistic settlement that America's allies will be forced to accept. NATO officials are privately in crisis mode, though you won't see this acknowledged publicly. If America negotiates directly with Russia over European security without consulting NATO partners, the alliance's credibility collapses immediately. European nations will be forced to choose between accepting American decisions or building independent capabilities they don't possess. The human cost of this strategic calculation is immense, but Trump operates from the realist tradition that prioritizes American interests over moral considerations. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have died fighting for territory that America is preparing to concede. From Washington's perspective, these are acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic advantage against China. Putin's position in these negotiations is stronger than most analysts recognize. Russia has achieved its primary objective of stopping NATO expansion eastward. Russian forces control roughly 20% of Ukrainian territory with established defensive positions. The Russian economy has adapted to Western sanctions through relationships with China, India, and other non-Western partners. Time favors Moscow, not Kiev. More importantly, Putin holds leverage that transcends the Ukrainian battlefield. Russian energy exports remain crucial for global markets. Russian nuclear capabilities constrain NATO's military options. Russian cooperation with China creates the two-front problem that American strategists fear most. Trump understands that splitting the Russia-China partnership requires offering Putin something valuable enough to risk Chinese displeasure. The economic mathematics support Trump's calculation. America has provided over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine since the invasion began. This represents money that could fund American infrastructure, defense modernization, or technology competition with China. Realist leaders ask whether Ukrainian territorial integrity is worth constraining American strategic flexibility. China's rise provides the strategic context that makes Ukrainian betrayal acceptable to American planners. Beijing's military modernization, technological advancement, and economic integration represent long-term threats that dwarf anything Russia can pose. Every dollar spent on Ukraine is a dollar not invested in containing China. Intelligence assessments confirm that China views the Ukraine conflict as a strategic gift. As long as America remains militarily engaged in Europe, China has freedom of action in the Pacific. Chinese military exercises around Taiwan have intensified while American attention focused on Eastern Europe. From Beijing's perspective, indefinite Ukraine conflict serves Chinese interests perfectly. European military capabilities remain inadequate for independent defense against Russian pressure. Despite increases in defense spending since 2022, European forces lack the logistics, ammunition production, and command structures necessary for sustained high-intensity warfare without American support. European unity fragmenting under economic pressure makes coordinated military action increasingly difficult. Germany's position is particularly problematic for European defense planning. German public opinion remains opposed to major military engagement, despite government promises of increased defense spending. German industrial dependence on stable energy supplies makes confrontation with Russia economically devastating. Any American-Russian deal that provides German energy security while abandoning Ukrainian territory will receive German support regardless of official protests. France's military capabilities are limited to power projection in former African colonies, not continental defense against peer competitors. French attempts to lead European strategic autonomy have failed to produce meaningful independent defense capacity. French influence over European policy is insufficient to override American strategic decisions. Eastern European nations that joined NATO for protection against Russian expansion face existential questions about alliance credibility. If America negotiates spheres of influence with Russia while excluding European input, these nations must recalculate their entire security architecture. Poland's territory would become the front line of any future Russian expansion westward. The Baltic states face even starker choices, as they may be forced to accept neutrality rather than face Russian absorption. The psychological impact on Ukrainian forces and civilian population cannot be overstated. Ukrainian resistance was sustained by beliefs about permanent Western support and eventual NATO membership. If these beliefs prove false, Ukrainian morale will collapse regardless of military capabilities. Zelensky's domestic political position becomes impossible if American support disappears. Ukrainian public opinion will demand leadership changes and negotiated settlements. The precedent established by Ukrainian abandonment will reshape global perceptions of American credibility. Taiwan's leadership is watching Ukrainian developments closely because parallels are obvious. If America abandons Ukraine to focus on Chinese containment, Taiwan cannot assume American support in any future cross-strait conflict. Middle Eastern allies face similar recalculations about the conditional nature of American security guarantees. The timeline for this betrayal is probably 6 months rather than years. Trump will demand immediate congressional action on Ukraine funding cuts, citing fiscal responsibility and domestic priorities. European leaders will be presented with fait accompli rather than consulted about policy changes. Ukrainian resistance will continue briefly but collapse as Western weapons supplies are terminated. Putin's acceptance of this deal requires careful management of Chinese reactions. Beijing invested heavily in the Russia-China partnership as insurance against Western pressure. If Russia abandons that partnership for American rapprochement, China faces strategic isolation that could trigger aggressive responses. The most likely Chinese response is accelerated military action against Taiwan before American resources can be fully redirected to Pacific defense. The next 6 months could see simultaneous Ukrainian collapse and Taiwan crisis as both sides of the American strategic realignment play out. European unity will fragment under the pressure of American abandonment and Russian resurgence. Eastern European nations will seek bilateral security relationships with America that bypass European Union decision-making. Western European nations will pursue accommodation with Russia to preserve economic relationships. NATO's institutional structure cannot survive American bilateral negotiations with Russia over European security architecture. If America makes strategic decisions without alliance consultation, NATO becomes a symbolic organization rather than functional military partnership. European nations will be forced to choose between American bilateral relationships and European collective arrangements. The geopolitical consequences reshape the international system fundamentally. American hegemony is replaced by spheres of influence arrangements that resemble 19th century great power politics. Smaller nations lose agency over their own security and must accept client status with regional hegemons. China emerges as the primary beneficiary if American-Russian rapprochement succeeds. Chinese isolation ends as Russia and America compete for Chinese partnership. Chinese military pressure on Taiwan increases as American resources focus on managing European realignment. Chinese technological development accelerates as American attention diverts from technology competition, but Trump's calculation may prove strategically sound despite the moral costs. If America cannot simultaneously contain China and Russia, choosing to neutralize Russia while focusing on China makes strategic sense. If European nations cannot defend themselves after 75 years of American protection, continued American sacrifice becomes unsustainable. If Ukrainian victory requires resources that prevent Chinese containment, Ukrainian abandonment serves broader American interests. The test of this strategy will be whether Russia actually reduces support for China or simply takes American concessions while maintaining Chinese partnership. Putin has historically treated Western agreements as tactical tools rather than binding commitments. Trump's deal only works if Putin honors agreements that contradict Russian strategic culture. The domestic American political consequences of Ukrainian betrayal remain uncertain. Democratic opposition will frame the policy as appeasement and abandonment of democratic allies. Trump's ability to maintain domestic support depends on demonstrable results in Chinese containment that justify Ukrainian sacrifice. The ultimate question is whether this betrayal serves long-term American strategic interests or represents short-term tactical thinking that creates larger problems. If Chinese containment requires total American focus and unlimited resources, Ukrainian abandonment may be strategically necessary. If Russian-American spheres of influence produce regional stability, Ukrainian sacrifice may represent wise strategy rather than moral failure. But if Putin exploits American concessions without providing reciprocal Chinese containment, America's strategic position deteriorates. If European resentment over Ukrainian abandonment undermines broader transatlantic cooperation, America's alliance system fragments. If Chinese military action accelerates in response to American-Russian rapprochement, America faces the two-front war it sought to avoid. The next 6 months will determine whether Ukrainian betrayal represents strategic genius or catastrophic miscalculation. European responses will test the durability of transatlantic relationships under stress. Chinese reactions will demonstrate whether American-Russian cooperation serves American interests or Chinese expansion. What we know now is that Trump has decided Ukrainian territorial integrity is less important than Chinese containment. Putin has decided Chinese partnership is less valuable than American accommodation. European leaders have discovered that alliance commitments are conditional rather than permanent. Ukraine's betrayal was inevitable once America decided that China posed the primary threat to American hegemony. Small nations have always been sacrificed when great powers recalculate their strategic priorities. The tragedy is that millions of Ukrainians believed Western promises about permanent support and eventual victory. The reality is that no promise is permanent when strategic circumstances change. Trump and Putin understand this. Europe is learning it. Ukraine is living it.